The funniest thing about fake authority is that it disappears the moment real ownership walks through the gate. The first thing I noticed that Tuesday morning wasn't the flashing blue lights. It was the sharp smell of freshly cut grass drifting across perfectly trimmed front lawns while a police cruiser rolled to a stop beside the neighborhood clubhouse, like someone had reported a bank robbery instead of a property dispute. I stood beside my old silver Ford F-150 with a paper coffee cup warming my hands, watching an HOA president in a spotless white pantsuit point directly at me as though she'd finally caught the criminal she'd been chasing for years. That's him, officers. He's trespassing on private HOA property. Her voice sliced through the quiet morning air with absolute confidence. A few neighbors paused their morning walks. Others slowed their golf carts. Curtains shifted behind polished windows. Everyone loves free entertainment when it happens on someone else's driveway. I took another sip of coffee without saying a word. The roasted bitterness lingered on my tongue while I listened to the gravel crunch beneath the officers' boots as they approached. One of them gave me the polite professional smile that comes from answering far too many neighborhood complaints. "Morning, sir. We received a call saying you're refusing to leave private property." I nodded once. "I'm not a member." The words barely left my mouth before the woman laughed loud enough for half the cul-de-sac to hear. "Exactly," she snapped. He admitted it. "He's not a member. He has no business being here." Her name was Linda Prescott, president of Willow Creek Estates HOA for nearly 6 years, and she wore that title the way some people wear a badge. Expensive perfume floated through the cool air every time she stepped closer, mixing with the scent of fresh mulch and gasoline from the landscapers working across the street. Everything about her projected certainty. Perfect hair, perfect smile, perfect belief that every rule existed because people like her enforced it. I looked past her toward the brick office building beside the clubhouse. Sunlight reflected off its front windows, and for just a second I caught my own reflection staring back at me. Blue jeans, work boots, faded flannel shirt. I looked more like a contractor than someone attending a real estate closing. That was fine with me. People reveal far more about themselves when they underestimate you. One officer asked for identification. I handed it over without hesitation. Linda folded her arms with a satisfied smile, as though the entire morning had already been decided. "I've been telling him he has to leave for 20 minutes, she said. "He keeps claiming he doesn't belong to the HOA. I nodded again. "Because I don't." The officer looked from me to Linda, then back again. Before he could ask another question, I glanced at my watch. 9:43, just 2 minutes behind schedule. Somewhere beyond the entrance, I heard another vehicle turning onto the property. Tires rolled slowly across the pavement before coming to a stop. I didn't smile. I didn't move. I simply watched the black sedan with the title company's logo pull into the parking lot exactly where I expected it to. The black sedan settled into a parking space with quiet precision, but I kept my eyes forward because I had learned a long time ago that timing was often worth more than words. My name is Nathan Carter, and for the last 15 years I have made a living buying commercial properties that other people overlooked. Old warehouses, aging office buildings, small retail centers where the paint had faded but the paperwork still held value. While most investors chased shiny new developments, I chased forgotten deeds, neglected lease agreements, and county records buried in filing cabinets that smelled like dust and old paper. My father used to tell me that every building has 2 stories, the one people can see and the one hidden inside the documents. The second story is usually the one that matters. That lesson built my career. I never wore expensive suits unless a closing required one. I drove the same pickup truck I had owned for almost a decade because it hauled survey equipment just as well as groceries. I preferred steel-toe boots over polished dress shoes because I spent more time walking properties than sitting behind conference tables. Looking ordinary had become an unexpected advantage. People rarely watched the quiet man carrying a clipboard. They underestimated him, talked too much around him, and often revealed exactly what they should have kept private. 3 months before that morning, one small listing had caught my attention. It was not the clubhouse. It was not the neighborhood itself. It was a 2-story brick office building sitting beside the entrance with a long-term commercial lease attached to it. The previous owner had retired to Arizona and wanted a clean sale without publicity. The numbers made sense. Stable tenants, predictable maintenance, room for future redevelopment. I signed the purchase agreement without ever meeting a single resident. As far as I was concerned, it was another business transaction. I had no interest in neighborhood politics. I certainly had no interest in arguing with homeowners associations. My attorney handled the legal review while the title company completed its searches. Everything moved exactly as planned. The only reason I came in person that morning was because I like seeing every property with my own eyes the day ownership changes hands. You notice details photographs never capture. The faint smell of fresh paint around the entrance. The worn corners on the front steps. The slight whistle of loose flagpoles in a gentle breeze. Even the way morning sunlight hits the windows tells you how a building has been treated over the years. I had barely stepped onto the sidewalk before Linda Prescott appeared with 2 board members behind her. She never asked who I was. She never introduced herself. She walked directly toward me holding a clipboard against her chest, as though it carried the authority of a courtroom. From the very first sentence, she assumed I was someone who needed permission simply because I happened to be standing where she believed she ruled. I remember thinking how remarkable confidence can look when it has never been forced to meet the limits of actual ownership. Linda Prescott had mastered a very specific kind of confidence, the kind that only grows when nobody has challenged it for years. By the time I met her, she had been president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association for almost 6 years, and the neighborhood treated her decisions less like board policies and more like natural law. Every mailbox matched because Linda insisted they should. Every flower bed looked identical because she approved every landscaping request herself. Every holiday decoration disappeared exactly when she expected because nobody wanted another violation letter taped to their front door. The clubhouse parking lot smelled faintly of fresh sealant and expensive car wax because appearances mattered more to Linda than almost anything else. She drove a white luxury sport utility vehicle that always looked freshly detailed, and she carried the same leather portfolio everywhere, as though important documents somehow became more important inside expensive leather. What fascinated me was not her authority. It was how completely she believed it had no limits. As I stood near the entrance that morning, I watched neighbors quietly avoid making eye contact with her. One older gentleman stopped walking his golden retriever the moment Linda glanced his way. A young couple loading groceries into the back of their crossover lowered their voices until she passed. Even the landscaping crew suddenly became very interested in trimming shrubs instead of watching the growing scene near the clubhouse. Fear does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like people choosing silence because silence is easier than arguing. Linda thrived on that silence. She pointed toward the brick office building without even looking at me. This property belongs to the association, she announced confidently enough for everyone nearby to hear. Nobody enters without authorization. I almost corrected her, but there was no point. Some lessons only work when people finish telling themselves the wrong story first. She asked where I lived. I answered honestly that I did not live in the neighborhood. Her smile widened. She asked for my membership number. I calmly explained that I did not have one. She looked at the officers with the expression of someone who believed the case had already been solved. One member of the HOA board standing beside her folded his arms and quietly muttered that outsiders always thought the rules did not apply to them. Another nodded as though they had rehearsed this conversation dozens of times before. The officers remained professional, asking simple questions while writing notes, but Linda kept interrupting with confident explanations about trespassing policies, community regulations, and association authority. Every sentence became slightly louder than the last. Every answer I gave seemed to frustrate her because I refused to argue. I simply listened, occasionally taking another sip of coffee as the warm cup slowly cooled in my hand. The morning breeze carried the smell of fresh coffee beans from a cafe across the boulevard, while sunlight reflected off the clubhouse windows behind her. Somewhere above us, a flag rope gently tapped against its metal pole with a slow, rhythmic clink that seemed almost louder than the conversation itself. Then Linda took one final step closer and said, "You should have left the moment I told you to." I looked past her toward the black sedan that had just finished parking. 2 people stepped out carrying slim document cases. Right on schedule. I glanced at my watch one more time and realized the longest 2 minutes of Linda Prescott's presidency had finally come to an end. The 2 people who stepped out of the black sedan wore simple business attire. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic, just the quiet confidence of professionals who spent their days handling signatures worth millions of dollars. Neither one hurried toward us. They simply opened the rear door, gathered a pair of document cases, and began walking across the parking lot at an unhurried pace. Linda barely glanced in their direction before turning her attention back to me. She had become completely committed to her version of the story. "Officer," she said, lifting her clipboard like it was evidence, "I have explained repeatedly that this individual refuses to identify himself as a resident, refuses to provide a membership number, and refuses to leave association property after being instructed to do so." The older officer looked at me with the same calm expression he had worn since arriving. "Sir, is there a reason you are remaining here?" I answered exactly as I had from the beginning. "Yes." Linda immediately interrupted. "There is no legal reason. He admitted he does not live here." I waited for her to finish before speaking again. "I am waiting for a scheduled meeting." She actually laughed. It was the kind of short, dismissive laugh designed for an audience more than a conversation. Several neighbors had drifted closer without pretending otherwise now. A maintenance worker shut off his leaf blower, and the sudden silence made every word echo across the brick courtyard. Linda shook her head with a smile that never reached her eyes. "Nobody scheduled a meeting with you. I oversee this property. I know every vendor, every contractor, every board appointment." She emphasized the word every as though repetition alone made ownership transferable. One of the board members standing behind her pulled out his phone and quietly started recording. Another whispered something about documenting evidence for future legal action. I noticed the officers exchange a quick glance. They were clearly trying to keep an ordinary property disagreement from becoming something larger. The younger officer politely asked if I had any documentation showing why I was there. "Not yet," I answered honestly. "The paperwork arrives in about 30 seconds." Linda folded her arms so tightly that the leather portfolio pressed against her side. "This is exactly what I mean. Excuses. Delays. People always think they can outsmart community rules." A light breeze carried the scent of blooming magnolia trees across the entrance, while the flag above the clubhouse fluttered softly against the bright blue sky. Everything about the morning felt strangely peaceful except for the tension gathering around us. I glanced once more toward the approaching pair from the sedan. They were now halfway across the lot, one carrying a sealed envelope, the other holding a thick binder with colored tabs sticking neatly from the edges. The older officer noticed them and asked, "Are they with you?" I simply nodded. Linda answered before I could speak. "It does not matter who they are. Nobody conducts business here without authorization from this association." Her certainty was absolute, and that was exactly why I remained silent. Some people only recognize the truth after they have repeated the mistake one final time. As the two professionals stopped just a few feet away, the woman smiled politely at me, opened the envelope with careful precision, and said in a clear voice that every person gathered outside the clubhouse could hear, "Good morning, Mr. Carter. We have your fully executed closing documents and confirmation that the transfer of ownership was officially recorded with the county 15 minutes ago. Congratulations on your acquisition." For the first time that morning, complete silence settled over the courtyard. Even the distant hum of a riding mower seemed to fade into the background. Linda stared at the woman holding the envelope as though she had misheard every word. The older police officer looked from the closing documents to me, then back again, waiting for someone to explain what had just happened. I accepted the envelope, thanked the representatives, and carefully removed the first page. The county recording stamp was still crisp, the ink so fresh it almost looked wet under the morning sun. My attorney had always told me that the most powerful documents never needed dramatic introductions. They simply spoke for themselves. I handed the first page to the officer before anyone else could say a word. He read the heading, glanced at the legal description, and quietly continued through the remaining lines. His expression did not become dramatic. It became professional. That subtle change said more than any argument ever could. Linda finally broke the silence. "There has to be some mistake." The representative from the title company smiled politely. "There is no mistake, ma'am. The transaction was recorded with the county this morning. Everything has been completed." Linda immediately pointed toward the brick office building behind us. "That building belongs to the homeowners association." The representative gently shook her head. "The association leases office space inside the building. The real estate itself has changed ownership." Another silence followed, heavier than the first one. I watched several neighbors exchange confused looks. One board member slowly lowered the phone that had been recording the entire encounter. The confidence that had filled the courtyard only minutes earlier seemed to drain away with every sentence. I did not interrupt. I did not celebrate. I simply waited because the facts were finally doing all the talking. The younger officer asked me one simple question. "Sir, were you here this morning to inspect the property after closing?" "Yes," I answered. "I always visit my properties on the first day." He nodded once before handing my identification back with a respectful smile. Linda looked between all of us as though she was searching for someone who would restore the version of reality she preferred. Instead, the title representative opened the binder and removed another document. Part of our closing procedure requires delivering formal notice to existing commercial tenants regarding the completed transfer of ownership. She looked directly at Linda. "Your association office is listed as one of those tenants." The words landed with remarkable calm, but their meaning spread across the small crowd almost instantly. I noticed the maintenance worker quietly restart his leaf blower before stopping again, apparently deciding he did not want to miss whatever happened next. A couple standing near the mailbox exchanged wide-eyed smiles. Nobody laughed. Nobody celebrated. They simply watched the truth unfold one page at a time. Linda reached for the notice with noticeably slower movements than before. The woman handed it to her courteously. I recognized the familiar document immediately because I had reviewed its language with my attorney the previous afternoon. It was not a warning. It was not a threat. It was simply the official notification every commercial tenant receives when ownership changes hands. Sometimes the biggest surprises arrive in plain white envelopes, and sometimes the loudest moment in a person's life is the instant they realize the paperwork has already been signed. Linda held the notification with both hands, reading the first page once, then again, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something more familiar. They did not. The morning breeze gently lifted one corner of the document before she pressed it flat again. Her confident smile had disappeared, replaced by the careful expression people wear when they suddenly realize they have been arguing with facts instead of assumptions. I set my coffee cup on the hood of my truck and thanked the title representatives for arriving exactly on schedule. They nodded politely. One of them handed me a second folder containing certified copies of the recorded deed, lease summaries, and contact information for every commercial tenant occupying the building. Everything was organized with color-coded tabs, exactly the way I preferred. The older police officer looked at the paperwork, then at the brick office building behind us. "So the association leases office space here?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. "The lease remains valid. Ownership simply transferred this morning." He nodded with quiet understanding. That single sentence changed the entire conversation. Nobody was being forced out. Nobody had lost legal protections. The only thing that had changed was who owned the property. Linda finally looked up from the documents. "Why did nobody tell us?" she asked, almost to herself. I answered honestly. The previous owner handled the sale privately. Existing tenants receive formal notice after the recording is complete. That is standard practice. The title representative confirmed exactly the same explanation. One of the board members slowly stepped closer and asked if their lease would continue under the existing terms. "Unless both parties negotiate changes in the future, yes," I said. "The lease transfers with the property." His shoulders relaxed almost immediately. It was obvious he understood commercial real estate better than he had let on earlier. Around us, the small crowd had changed completely. Instead of watching a confrontation, they were listening to what sounded more like a business meeting. The younger officer closed his notebook and smiled politely. "It sounds like this is now a civil matter that has been clarified." I appreciated how carefully he chose his words. No embarrassment, no accusations, just a professional acknowledgement that the misunderstanding had been resolved. Linda remained unusually quiet. She looked toward the office entrance where the association logo was mounted beside the front door. For years that sign had probably felt permanent. Now it represented something different. It marked the location of a tenant, not an owner. There is a subtle but important difference between managing a space and owning the ground beneath it. Many people never think about that distinction until the day it matters. I picked up my coffee again, now only slightly warm, and walked a few steps toward the entrance. The familiar scent of fresh brick, trimmed hedges, and newly sealed pavement filled the air. I had visited dozens of newly acquired properties over the years, and every first visit felt almost identical. Inspect the exterior, meet the tenants, learn the routines, build professional relationships. That had always been my plan for the morning. The unexpected argument had simply delayed it. As I reached the front sidewalk, I turned back toward the group and said calmly, "I came here to introduce myself, inspect the property, and make sure every tenant knows they have a reliable landlord. I still intend to do exactly that." Nobody interrupted. For the first time since I arrived, every conversation in the courtyard was guided not by assumptions or raised voices, but by signed documents, recorded ownership, and the quiet certainty that comes when the truth finally has a chance to speak for itself. The title representatives wished everyone a good morning, returned to their sedan, and quietly drove away, leaving behind something far more powerful than a dramatic speech. They left certainty. The officers exchanged a few final words with one another before the older one turned toward me with a respectful nod. "It looks like everything has been clarified, Mr. Carter. Thank you for your cooperation." I thanked both officers for handling the situation professionally. They climbed back into their cruiser, and within moments the flashing lights disappeared beyond the neighborhood entrance. As the sound of the engine faded, the atmosphere changed again. Without uniforms, sirens, or raised voices, Willow Creek suddenly felt like an ordinary Tuesday morning. Birds chirped from the oak trees lining the street. Sprinklers clicked methodically across neatly trimmed lawns. Somewhere nearby, the smell of bacon drifted from an open kitchen window. Life continued exactly as it had before, except everyone standing in front of the office building now understood who actually owned it. Linda remained unusually quiet, holding the transfer notice against her portfolio. One of the board members stepped beside her and quietly asked if they should return inside for their scheduled meeting. She hesitated before answering. Yes. It was the first time I had heard uncertainty in her voice all morning. Before anyone walked away, I spoke calmly. "There is one thing I would like to make clear." They all turned toward me. "Nothing about today's ownership transfer changes my expectation that every tenant will be treated fairly. Your association has a valid lease. I intend to honor every legal obligation attached to that agreement." Relief spread across more than one face. I could almost see shoulders relaxing throughout the small group. They had probably imagined the worst after hearing the word ownership. That was never my approach. Commercial real estate is built on stable relationships, not unnecessary conflict. I opened the second folder and removed a neatly organized contact sheet. Over the next few weeks, my property management team will inspect the building, review maintenance schedules, and introduce themselves to every tenant. If something needs attention, we fix it. If something works well, we leave it alone. That is how I have always managed my properties. One board member, a gray-haired accountant named Richard, whose name I had seen on the tenant list, finally spoke directly to me. "So the association continues operating normally?" I smiled. "As long as everyone follows the lease, absolutely." He nodded with visible appreciation. Linda looked at me for several long seconds before quietly asking, "You knew who we were this entire time, did not you?" I answered without hesitation. I knew who my tenants were before I arrived. I simply expected to introduce myself after the closing. She lowered her eyes toward the notice again, and for the first time since we met, she seemed more interested in listening than speaking. The irony was impossible to ignore. Earlier that morning, she believed authority came from standing at the entrance and deciding who belonged. Standing in exactly the same place now, everyone had learned that authority begins much earlier, with recorded deeds, signed contracts, and responsibilities that extend far beyond a clipboard. I picked up my coffee, now completely cold, and smiled to myself. Sometimes the strongest position in a disagreement belongs to the person who never needs to raise his voice because the paperwork has already said everything that matters. The rest of the morning unfolded very differently from the way anyone standing in that courtyard had expected. Instead of arguments, there were introductions. Instead of accusations, there were questions about maintenance schedules, parking agreements, and future communication. I unlocked the front entrance with the key packet I had received at closing, and the familiar scent of fresh paint mixed with old office carpet greeted me as I stepped inside. The reception area was clean but dated, with framed community newsletters covering one wall and a large neighborhood map hanging behind the front desk. I took a slow walk through the common hallway, making notes about lighting fixtures, ceiling tiles, and landscaping visible through each window. Years of managing commercial properties had taught me that successful ownership rarely depended on dramatic decisions. It depended on hundreds of small details that most people never noticed until something stopped working. A few minutes later, Richard knocked lightly on the open office door where I was reviewing mechanical inspection records. He carried a folder and offered an apologetic smile. "I wanted to introduce myself properly," he said. "This morning became more complicated than anyone expected." I shook his hand and invited him inside. We spent nearly 20 minutes discussing the building, the association's lease, and several maintenance requests that had apparently been waiting for approval for months. He spoke professionally, and I appreciated that. Good business conversations begin when assumptions end. Before leaving, Richard paused for a moment. "I hope today's misunderstanding does not affect how you see everyone here." I smiled. One difficult morning does not define an entire community. Buildings last for decades. Relationships should too. He nodded with visible relief before quietly closing the door behind him. Later that afternoon, my property management company arrived to begin their standard onboarding inspection. They photographed exterior walls, checked roof access, reviewed utility rooms, and confirmed that emergency lighting and fire safety equipment were functioning properly. Everything followed the same checklist we used for every newly acquired property across the state. There were no surprise inspections targeting anyone, no unnecessary demands, and certainly no retaliation. Professional management works because consistency matters more than emotion. As I walked through the parking lot with the property manager, several residents waved as they drove past. Earlier that morning, they had watched me from a distance with uncertain expressions. Now a few stopped simply to introduce themselves. One retired schoolteacher thanked me for promising to keep the building well maintained. Another homeowner mentioned that the association office roof had leaked during heavy storms for nearly a year. I wrote every concern into my notebook because that was exactly why I visited properties personally. Listening often reveals more than inspecting. Just before sunset, I noticed Linda leaving the office carrying a small stack of folders. She walked toward her vehicle, paused, then turned back in my direction. "Mr. Carter," she called politely. I walked over. After a brief silence, she said, "I should have asked who you were before assuming why you were here." Her words were simple, without excuses or dramatic explanations. I appreciated that more than any lengthy apology. We all make decisions with incomplete information sometimes, I answered. The important part is what we do after we learn the truth. She nodded once, got into her vehicle, and quietly drove away. Watching the evening sunlight reflect across the brick walls of the building, I realized the property itself had not changed at all that day. Only the way people understood ownership, respect, and the difference between authority that is claimed and authority that is earned had truly been transformed. Over the next several months, Willow Creek became one of the easiest commercial properties I had ever managed, not because it was perfect, but because everyone finally understood where responsibility began and where it ended. My property management team completed every scheduled inspection on time, repaired the roof above the association office before the rainy season arrived, upgraded exterior lighting around the parking lot, and replaced aging irrigation controls that had been wasting thousands of gallons of water every month. None of those improvements made dramatic headlines. They simply made the property work the way it was supposed to. Every quarterly meeting with the association became more productive than the one before. Conversations shifted away from assumptions and toward solutions. Lease renewals, maintenance requests, insurance updates, and landscaping improvements replaced the unnecessary conflicts that had consumed so much energy in the past. Even Linda changed. She still cared deeply about the neighborhood, but she asked more questions before reaching conclusions. During one meeting, she quietly admitted that the events of that Tuesday morning had reminded her how easily confidence could become overconfidence. I respected her willingness to grow because that quality is far more valuable than pretending mistakes never happened. As for me, I continued doing exactly what I had always done. I bought properties, studied documents, met tenants, and tried to leave every building better than I found it. People sometimes asked whether I planned that confrontation from the beginning, and my answer was always the same. No, I planned a routine property inspection. Everything else happened because someone decided that appearances mattered more than facts. The old pickup truck remained in my driveway. The expensive suit stayed in the closet unless a closing required one. I still believe that the quietest person in a conversation often learns the most. Every time I drove past the entrance to Willow Creek, I noticed the same brick office building where that unforgettable morning began. The walls had not changed. The parking lot looked the same. The flag still waved gently above the clubhouse whenever the afternoon breeze rolled through the neighborhood. Yet I always remembered standing there with a cup of cooling coffee while everyone assumed they already knew my story. They never asked why I was there. They only decided who they thought I must be. That experience reinforced a lesson my father taught me years ago while we walked through one of my first investment properties. He told me that ownership is not measured by how loudly someone speaks or how confidently they point at a rulebook. Ownership is measured by responsibility, patience, and the willingness to let the facts stand on their own. Those words carried me through every negotiation of my career, and they proved true again that morning. Looking back now, I do not remember the flashing lights nearly as clearly as I remember the silence that followed the recorded deed. That silence was the moment assumptions surrendered to reality. It reminded everyone present that real authority never needs to announce itself before the paperwork is complete. The strongest position is rarely held by the loudest voice in the parking lot. It belongs to the person who prepared carefully, respected the process, and allowed the truth to arrive exactly on schedule. That is why I never felt the need to win an argument that day. The documents had already done it long before anyone realized whose name was written at the top of the page.